The summer sun had just begun its descent behind the tall pines, casting long golden rays across the cul-de-sac where Margaret and I had lived for the past 15 years. Our house wasn't the fanciest in the neighborhood, but it was home, a place built with sweat, savings, and dreams. The neighborhood had changed over time. Families came and went, but one constant presence was Helen, our self-appointed queen of the HOA. Everyone quietly called her Karen, though never to her face. She was relentless about enforcing rules that didn't even exist, and to her, everyone was a suspect breaking them. I had gotten used to her nitpicking over trash bins or lawn lengths, but what happened that day went far beyond anything I ever imagined. Margaret, my wife, had always carried herself with quiet dignity. She was calm, thoughtful, and strong in ways I admired but never fully understood. She rarely raised her voice, and when she did, it was only because she believed in something deeply. A retired officer, she carried her past like a shadow, visible only when circumstances made it so. Our neighbors didn't know much about her background. She never spoke about her years in service, nor about the things she had seen and done. She was happy tending to her roses, reading on the porch, or waving to kids riding their bikes down the street. It was enough for her. But Helen couldn't stand Margaret. I suspect it was because Margaret ignored her petty complaints, refusing to bow down or play the game so many others did. Helen thrived on control, and Margaret wasn't someone easily controlled. That simmering resentment, mixed with Helen's constant need for drama, created a storm waiting to happen. And it happened on one of the most ordinary evenings. I was in the garage, fiddling with some old tools when I heard the shrill sound of Helen's voice outside. At first, I thought it was just another complaint about someone's sprinklers, but then I heard the unmistakable edge of panic, manufactured panic, cutting through her words. "She has a gun!" Helen screamed. My heart dropped as I rushed the driveway. Margaret was standing near the garden, wearing her usual denim jacket, calm as ever, pulling weeds. She looked up as Helen pointed from the sidewalk, her face red and twisted with drama. "She has a gun. She's dangerous." Helen shrieked into her phone, her voice rising, desperate for the attention she craved. I froze for a moment, torn between disbelief and anger. Margaret didn't even flinch. She simply looked at Helen with the same steady gaze she had used countless times before in situations far more serious than this suburban circus. But I knew how quickly lies could spiral, and Helen's words had the power to summon something we couldn't control: the police. My stomach knotted as the distant wail of sirens grew closer. Time slowed. All I could think was how easily things could go wrong. The cruiser screeched to a halt outside our house, lights flashing, doors flying open. Officers spilled out, hands near their holsters, eyes scanning with practiced alertness. For a split second, I feared the worst. What if they believed Helen's lie? What if one wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, turned our lives upside down? My throat tightened. Margaret stood perfectly still, her hands visible, her expression calm. She had seen this before, not here in suburbia, but in places where tension was thicker and consequences heavier. She knew how to handle it. Then it happened. The first officer approached, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on Margaret. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw recognition flicker across his face. His mouth opened, then closed. His hand dropped away from his holster. "Commander," he said, his voice uncertain but filled with respect. The other officers froze. Margaret's gaze softened just slightly, and she gave a small nod. The air changed instantly. What had been seconds away from chaos became still. The officers stood straighter, their faces shifting from suspicion to something else entirely. One by one, they saluted. "Yes, Commander," the lead officer said firmly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Helen's face drained of color. The same mouth that shouted lies now hung open in disbelief. She tried to sputter something, pointing and shaking, but no sound carried the same power it had moments ago. She was no longer the center of attention. She was irrelevant, a clown exposed in front of the very audience she had summoned. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes, the tension melting from my shoulders. Margaret remained calm, her dignity unshaken. She hadn't asked for this scene, hadn't sought recognition, but it had arrived all the same. The officers lowered their salutes, and the lead one stepped closer, speaking quietly, respectfully, as if in the presence of someone who had once led him through darker times. I didn't hear every word, but I saw the look in his eyes, gratitude, reverence, and memory. Margaret gave him a small smile and a nod, then turned back to her roses as if nothing had happened. Helen, on the other hand, couldn't move. She stammered something about HOA rules and weapons, but her voice carried no weight now. The officers didn't even glance at her. She had cried wolf, and her performance had collapsed under the weight of truth. One officer finally turned to her and said, "Ma'am, I think we've heard enough." That was the end of her theater. She stormed away, her indignation trailing behind her like smoke, but we all knew something inside her had cracked. Control had slipped from her fingers. That night, after the cruisers left and the neighborhood returned to its uneasy quiet, I sat with Margaret on the porch. The crickets sang, and the stars peeked through the branches above us. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked softly. "All these years, and you never said." She looked at me, her eyes tired but kind. "Because it wasn't about me," she said. "It was about the people I served with, the lives we tried to protect, the things we carried home. Titles don't matter here. I just wanted peace." Her words sank deep into me. I realized then what real strength looked like, not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the quiet kind that endures, that seeks no spotlight, that simply carries on. Margaret had built her life on service, not applause. Even when confronted with lies, she had remained composed, her dignity untouchable. And in that moment, when the truth was revealed, it wasn't victory she sought. It was simply to return to her roses. The neighborhood buzzed for weeks. Whispers traveled from porch to porch about the salute and commander. Some neighbors looked at Margaret with newfound respect, others with curiosity, but she never entertained questions. She went on as before, watering her garden, baking pies, living in peace. Helen, however, was quieter. She still prowled around with her clipboard and her complaints, but her voice had lost its edge. Something in her had been humbled, even if she'd never admit it. She no longer dared to shout accusations at Margaret. Perhaps she had learned that there are some people you simply cannot diminish. Life returned to its rhythm. Yet for me, everything felt different. That evening had changed the way I saw not only my wife, but the way I understood dignity, truth, and strength. I learned that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It lives in the character of a person, in their ability to remain steady when the world tilts toward chaos. It reminded me that lies, no matter how loudly shouted, can never outshine the quiet power of truth. And it taught me that sometimes the best way to respond to falsehood is not with anger or retaliation, but with calmness that reveals everything on its own. Now, years later, whenever I sit on that same porch and watch Margaret tend her roses, I still see that moment, the salutes, the silence, the shift of power. But more than that, I see the lesson she gave me, that peace is built not by control or fear, but by steady hands, by compassion, by a refusal to be shaken by the noise around us. And I carry that with me, knowing that even in a world full of Helens, truth stands firm, dignity endures, and strength often wears the gentlest face.